Hello, I'm Don Carson. This is the 11th part of a 14-part series called The God Who Is There. The unlikely title for this talk is The God Who Declares the Guilty Just. If we take that title literally, we might conclude that God himself must be unjust. For surely only an unjust judge would declare guilty people to be just. Isn't it his job to declare the guilty guilty and to declare the just just? Mind you, that would be bad news for us because the Bible goes to great length to point out how universal and how repulsive all our sin is to God. If God declares the guilty guilty, we are all damned. Yet, in fact, one of the most astute of Jesus' earliest disciples, the Apostle Paul, goes to considerable length to explain how the cross itself shows God to be simultaneously just and the one who declares guilty people to be just. If the cross and resurrection stand at the heart of the gospel, a point I tried to sketch in during the 10th address, then explaining a little more closely what Jesus' death and resurrection achieved is nothing other than explaining a little more closely what the gospel is. The God who declares the guilty just. At a certain level, that almost seems perverse. Members of the jury, I am not asking for mercy or pardon. I want justice. I am demanding full acquittal. Yes, I committed the murder of which I am accused, but I'm not guilty. Members of the jury, you must consider all my good deeds, not merely as mitigating circumstances, but as reason for exonerating me. The goodness of my other deeds outweighs the crime I committed. My good deeds require a not guilty verdict. If justice is to be done, you must find me innocent. So writes Todd Wilkin. And now suddenly you see that an approach which depends finally on our balancing of good deeds and bad deeds begins to look ridiculous. We don't even do that in a secular world, do we? So how shall we think that God looks at things? This God who is himself spectacularly holy and does not see our deeds as things that are weighed in a balance against other deeds, but sees our lives in mortal defiance against him. That's the way the Bible's storyline is unpacked. Now, in a few moments, we're going to look at Romans 3, 21 to 26. Martin Luther called this paragraph the center of the book of Romans and indeed of the whole Bible. But before we actually look at these verses, we should remind ourselves where they fall within Paul's letter to the Romans. This falls in the New Testament, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the Acts of the Apostles, which follows on from Christ's resurrection through the first 3 decades or so of the church, and then a sheaf of letters written by the Apostle Paul. The first one in the New Testament is Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 3. But before we get to chapter 3, from 1:18 to 3:20, Paul's entire argument is designed to show how we are guilty. What these 2.5 chapters do is unpack in theological terms the Bible's storyline up to this point, from Genesis 3 on. So we read Romans 1:18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of human beings who suppress the truth because of their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. And then the remaining 2.5 chapters set out to show that if you come from the line of Abraham, through the covenant with Moses, and have received a whole lot of revelation from God, or alternatively, you come from outside that line, from any other sort of heritage. Nevertheless, both lines, Jews and Gentiles alike, without exception, end up guilty before God. Supposing you know more about what God wants, then what you discover is you still don't meet those standards. And in some ways, those very standards can compound the rebellion and make you more guilty because you do know more. Alternatively, if you come from a heritage where you've been exposed to very little of what God has said, you don't even come up to that standard. On every front, we are a guilty people. Now, this is so out of line with contemporary self-perception that when you read some of what Paul says without developing a feel for the whole storyline to this point, it just seems over the top. He finishes the section in 3:9-20 with a raft of biblical quotations, quoting himself the Old Testament. This is what he says. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike, that means therefore the whole human race, are all under the power of sin, as it is written. And now you get these quotations, all snippets from the Old Testament scriptures. There is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, if you've walked in here for the first time and you come from an utterly secular background and you hear some joker at the front of the room quoting lines like this, you think, has he taken leave of his senses? Oh, I know that there's some bad people out there, Stalin maybe, and Pol Pot, I suppose, and Hitler, of course. But, what about Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders? Aren't there a lot of good people doing good things out there? And at a certain level, Paul would agree with that. Historically, Christians have often called such good things the work of common grace. That is grace that God gives commonly to all kinds of people. But his probing is deeper than that. It's not whether or not there are many good things, pieces of art, a wonderful symphony, self-sacrificing doctors on the frontiers of a horrible disease, and much, much, much more. It's not whether or not those things are done. We have already seen that the Bible presents human beings to be horrible contradictions with so much potential, reflecting something of the goodness of creation and the glory of God, and at the other hand, corrupt, abusive, twisted, and above all, self-focused. And that is, according to the entire storyline of the Bible to this place, the heart of all evil.